Hello and welcome to an introduction to the roles and responsibilities of a club committee. We're here because of the Port Adelaide Enfield Council actually providing us with the opportunity to give you whatever you may need in relation to undertaking your responsibilities and perhaps understanding your roles more effectively as well. So we hope that the tips and processes we give you will be of great assistance to you. I'm Hans van Bevel, and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself in terms of why I'm here perhaps doing this presentation. And that's because I've been involved with particularly sports administration for about 12 years now, mainly through a program called the Star Club program, which the State Government Office for Recreation, Sport and Racing actually initiated. And I've been involved with mentoring many clubs in relation to their governance and in ways that they may be able to operate more effectively. So this is an ideal link, if you like, to that experience. I'm also a club administrator and have been secretary of my club for some time, and that gives me, I guess, two sides to the story, because I'm also a recipient of the policies and responsibilities and so on that we actually have to generate. So we've got some formal aims, as it were, which I think are important for you to realise what we're doing. The first one is an outline of the roles and responsibilities of a committee as a team. I think the word team is quite important because we often think of our sporting groups as teams, but committees should operate as a team as well. Next, a checklist of the roles and responsibilities for key committee office bearers. So there are a couple that we feel need a little bit of specialisation and a bit of attention. And finally, recommended tips and resources that will help with understanding and action planning, because at the end of the day, we hope that you'll be able to look at what we've given, take in the things that you think you may already be doing well, but also be prepared to do some improvement as well. So I guess the key factor in all of this, as we see the people there around the table, is that you're responsible for the overall organisation's management, including a few of the following headings that I'll be giving you with a little bit of detail on the side to just make it clear. The most important one is that your central role is that of governance. It sounds a little bit tedious and administrative, and I guess in a way it is, but clubs are becoming more and more business-like, and they need to be. There are more legal requirements and so on, as you're probably aware. So this is just to give you an idea of what we think are the important things in this way. First thing is ensuring adherence to legal compliance and the Constitution. I guess that's the foundation of actually running things right. I've come across clubs that have been in trouble with fraud, been in trouble with discrimination and so on. And if you get your issues right at the beginning, then you'll find that the rest will generally flow. Applying risk management is also key, and that's both physical and emotional safety. Developing local policies that actually benefit the club and its members. I mean, you are there for the members, and the policy should be there to support the membership as well. Planning and focusing on the long term and advancement of objectives. You are the people who are able to put forward ways in which the club can thrive in the long term future as well as short term. Managing finances, budgeting and reporting. Again, that's a very important issue because you need to feel that you understand where your club's going from a financial perspective, and also it has ramifications for costings of facilities, your membership costs and so on. And finally, linking policies and guidelines consistent to those of the parent body. Now, the parent body, for some people, are an ogre, for some people, they're a friend. I would suggest that you do your best to make sure that you use the advice and information that's often provided by your parent body. I think that really will stand you in good stead if you at least make the attempt, and you'll be surprised sometimes with what information they can give you. Here are some of the other important responsibilities as well. The first one that I put down is culture, other than governance, of course. Creating and maintaining the environment you want by the way you want your club members to behave. And I have to say it includes yourselves as a committee as well. So the idea is that you, through the values of the club, actually determine how your club actually should be operating and be seen to be operating by people outside. It's an important thing of actually dealing with your responsibilities to make your environment safe and welcoming. Secondly, there, relationship development. I do also see quite a lot of clubs who are very internalised, whereas quite often there are clubs that are out there that have very, very useful advice that they could give you, and you can share yours as well. And I think the more you can do that, whether it's at conferences or by just asking clubs that are in your neighbourhood, that can be a great way to actually improve the way you operate. Marketing, promoting yourself and successes. Now that's something that a lot of Australians in our culture, we don't tend to fly the flag for very much at times. And I guess the idea here is that you look at all your media opportunities and do your best to actually make sure that your club is promoted in a way that you want it to, and that represents those values I was talking about. Code of conduct. Quite often your parent organisation will actually have a centralised template for your code of conduct, but then clubs will often do their own, so it's tailored to your specific needs. If you're in a region, for example, you may have specific issues around travel and transport, for example, in the way that you expect members to actually operate in terms of going on public transport, things like that. Managing subcommittees. I'm going to cover this shortly because it deserves its own little slide. Next one, orientation and induction. Very useful for people who are joining the club, but also for actually joining the committee. And it just needs to be a checklist that someone will take up and then follow through with, and I suggest a kind of buddying approach is a great way to do it. If it's a club member, a competitor of some sort, or indeed an official, I suggest someone who's more experienced actually play the role of mentor. Maybe for 2 months, 3 months, until you feel they're confident and that they're made to feel comfortable with what they're doing. The same applies in the committee. For example, an induction pack for committee would include things like the last 3 minutes of the last 3 meetings, and also the AGM is always very useful because that's an important period of time as well. And also, if you include other information that you think would be helpful, like major projects that you're working on, things like that. Also refer both groups that I'm referring to any website or other media opportunities they have to read the material that you might offer to them. Succession planning. It's often the bane of most people in committees. I know our clubs definitely had challenges that way, but it's important to start somewhere and to seek out volunteers, potential influencers, and even committed members that you think would make good leaders or good contributors. In my club, for example, our captains are expected to be on the committee. They're only in their early 20s. I've now resigned as secretary, our president has resigned as president, and 2 of those young people now have those leading roles. It's a really good way to help them get to understand what it's like to actually be on a committee. The other thing is they can add it to their CV as an experience issue, and that's really good if you want to actually say there's a benefit on their side as well as for the club. Communication, I think that speaks for itself. Obviously using communication as much as you can. There never seems to be enough, or it's not always done right. But think about your communication approaches and also be willing to seek feedback. Don't be afraid of feedback. You'll often find that that's the way that people actually feel appreciated in your club. But if they're not asked, they might feel, well, what's the point of even raising issues, unless they do it behind your back. Constitution relevance. Your constitution should generally be up to date, and I think that's pretty key. And I won't go into that now because that's sort of a separate issue in itself, but it's just important to make sure that you understand what is needed to be up to date. And finally, balancing short and long-term thinking. It might seem like a long list, but I think you'll find that your club is probably doing perhaps the majority of those. It's really just looking out for 1 or 2 things that you might think, well, we need to improve, if not 3 or 4. Okay, just a few key reminders now. Firstly, have you appointed a public officer? If you've never heard of a public officer, perhaps you should find out. The Office for Consumer and Business Services, a state government department, is responsible for anything to do with incorporation. Now, if a club is almost certainly incorporated, then all you need to do is have somebody who every year, usually after an AGM, advise of any changes that may have occurred in the club in that year around things like maybe it's even the name of the club, which is important in an incorporation way, and also anything to do with club leadership changes on the committee. Have you committed to providing a child-safe environment? I think that's probably something that's being promoted quite a lot. Obviously important that volunteers do police checks in terms of children checks, and also there should be a child safety officer. And I've certainly had people who are, for example, in a bowling club say, well, do we really need one of those? And I say, well, on a Saturday afternoon, who goes to bowling these days? Often it's young families with young children. And once a child is on site, it's really important that they be in a safe environment. So it's a very, very good thing, a very professional way of actually dealing with that issue if you've got your child safety officer. And then finally, have you actually provided an inclusive culture? It may be on the values list, but you have to practice it. One key way of doing that fairly simply in terms of getting organised as to what that means is go to a product called Play by the Rules, which the Office for Recreation, Sport and Racing has done. And you can do a very short online course around it. And again, if there's any holes or gaps, you can actually do something about it. Now, I've given you quite a lot of information at this point. I'd like you to think of this as a little bit of a reflection and action opportunity. And just think about some of the things that I've mentioned and actually do a bit of prioritising around what are some of the things that we really need to do and think about which are the most important that we need to change. And later on, I'll give you some tips on how to do an action plan itself, because often we tell people to plan, but we don't give the advice on how to. So just do that for the moment, and then you'll be able to move on, I think, quite comfortably. Okay, I mentioned I was going to expand a bit on subcommittees. And you'll see the two little people there in cartoon fashion. The idea of a subcommittee is really more than one person. And in clubs, quite often I'm finding that one person who's always been there is the one that everybody relies on. And this is a way to kind of spread the load. And I think that's really important. So a subcommittee of 2 is fine. And up to 4 is probably also possible. Any bigger than that, and you're kind of defeating the purpose of a subcommittee. So the idea is that you can use it for almost anything to do with club activity, and it takes away from the committee as a whole having to do everything. And also, if you've got a committee of, say, 12 people, as some committees have, even though it's desirable to have less, then it's very cumbersome and it takes forever to discuss even the smallest of points. So your subcommittees will report to the committee and you decide. So the committee is responsible for the subcommittee's activities and outcomes. So you'll see there arranged, I won't go into all of them, but for example, the most common one is social events. Isn't it normal to have 2 or 3 people say, okay, you find the venue, you deal with the people that you need to deal with, you organise the invitations and so on. It's a little project, and I think it works very well for a lot of things, even major things like facilities upgrades. Now, I wanted to give you some benefits, because if you're a little bit worried about actually delegating material to subcommittees, and subcommittees are a bit worried about taking on tasks, I hope these benefits make it a little bit easier for you to think, yeah, it's really worthwhile. So I won't probably read them all, but I'll certainly cover most of them. First of all, I mentioned already, it delegates some of the work out so that the committee doesn't have to do everything. It also introduces new helpers, and that's always a good thing. It helps the committee learn who's out there with needed skills, so it actually forces you to say, now, is this someone who's really good at IT staff, or is this somebody who's really good on promotion, etc. Allows for people with special skills to get involved, and I think that then helps the committee increase its expertise as a group. It's also short-term and specific. It's normally a short-term thing, like the social thing, comes every Christmas or whenever it comes, or near AGMs, maybe 2 or 3 months at most. And that's also more inviting to somebody you might ask to do the project, whether within the committee or outside the committee. And it allows the committee to focus on what I think is really important, and that is to look at strategic matters, because you're the only ones that have the authority to really look at the strategic side of your club. It may help recruit potential committee members if asked. In other words, they do a project, if you've got a volunteer from outside the committee, you might say, look, we're really terrific the way you did it, we're really impressed, would you consider joining the committee? And once they've got to know the club a little better, they may well say yes. And finally, it helps the ultimate, which is succession planning. So this way, it's a great way to recruit people that you otherwise maybe would never even know about, but it does take you to be prepared to actually go and confront people in a very constructive and positive way and say, hey, we've got something we reckon you'd be really good at. And a lot of people are prepared to help. If they really value your club, some of them will think, yeah, I think I can manage that if it's only for a couple of months. So I'm doing another reflection point now, because I think it's such an important area, and that is to really look at what projects do you think you might be able to make into subcommittee projects rather than whole of committee activity. and really be brave, if you like, to actually consider that, particularly now I've given you all the benefits of actually operating that way. Now, I said that I would cover some specialist roles, and the three that I'm going to cover today, and there are generally more, but these are the three that I think everyone realises is probably most critical to the club and its success. And you see the lady there with the violin. Now, normally a violinist, particularly if it's a lead violinist in an orchestra, has a whole lot of instruments that actually follow the way that she would actually tune up and then play. And I think that's very much the role of some of these key people. They're important in their own right, so she would be talented in what she does, but she's also influencing everybody else. And I like the metaphor, if you like, of being in harmony. So we expect a President, Secretary and Treasurer, for example, to have special skills of their own, but they need to work in harmony with the whole committee and really operate like a team, as I mentioned before. So I've actually designed this particular slide with little boxes, and I think the idea here is that if you use this as a checklist for what's required of a president, it gives you a very good start if you don't have anything in writing at the moment. We're also going to offer you a suggestion of some templates that you might want to research as well. You may prefer that, but at least if you did that and nothing else, you'd already have a very convenient checklist. Again, for succession planning, can be really good if you want to actually invite people to actually take over that role. It's also quite common for presidents to do things other than their actual role. In other words, to burden themselves with things that really should belong to either to somebody else in the committee or another one of the key committee positions. So it's also what not to do, if you like. So a lot of this is about influencing people. Firstly, encouraging adherence to code of conduct and the values of the club. You're very much a figurehead when you're a president, and so that's why it's such an important role. Demonstrate leadership and influence overall direction. And this is again starting to think about the longer term, the key areas of the club values and so on. Build relationships with stakeholders. No matter how much social media we might have, there's nothing like personal contact. And particularly if you've got stakeholders, they could be sponsors, they could be your local council, whoever, it's a good idea to actually build a relationship with them. I remember dealing with one club who was very, very willing to bag their council until they wanted a $400,000 grant. And you could say there was a slight hiccup in that process. So it doesn't pay to actually ignore your stakeholders, and you should know who they are, by the way, but rather really build a rapport with them as much as you can. Next, represent the organisation in community situations. So quite often councils in particular will have open days, maybe schools that have open days, and you can certainly see if you can actually give people information about the club, particularly if it's in a local area, and that's becoming more and more a way to actually gain recruits and gain understanding of the value of your club in your community. Sound understanding of the governance processes and the constitution obviously is important. Facilitate discussion and decision making, and that normally happens particularly within meetings but also outside meetings at times as well, as long as those decisions are made in collaboration with any other key people that are necessary to do so. Knowledge of future plans, especially long term. That's where you really have a key role as a president. And if you set up the idea of having long-term information within meetings, for example, then you'll find that it'll be a way that the committee will actually start to think of balance between short and long-term thinking. I normally think the 80-20 rule applies there. 80% of your work will be short-term, but the 20% that's long-term, the president should be able to influence. Manage agreed meeting processes, including who's to chair, and a chair does not necessarily have to be the president. So you can find that it's a way that your committee will decide what is the best person for that chairing role. It's not always the president. And finally, maintain a focus on the vision, which links to that strategic direction that I talked about previously. The secretary. I'm a bit biased because I've been a secretary for a long time. But all the other secretaries that I come across, we generally are in accord as to what secretaries are supposed to do, and I'll go through that very quickly as well. Obviously maintain committee activity records, so the centralised recording is normally done by the secretary. Again, it can be delegated, but the secretary has the ultimate responsibility, whether that's on a computer or whether it's a hard copy of information. Coordinate agenda items prior to meetings. Again, that's setting it up for administrative success, I suppose you could say. Managing the minutes of the meetings after a meeting occurs, and also as the meeting is happening as well, they're normally the recorder. Manage the communication process. So they're a conduit to all communication that comes from outside the club, as well as inside the club, as well as inside the committee. And I've got a little asterisk there. Receive and send correspondence, and I guess that's pretty basic. Collaborate with committee members on important items requiring discussion. So that's really critical as well in terms of making sure that the committee's abreast with what's going on. If you get a letter that's from, say, your parent organisation and you don't communicate that to other people, you're the one with the privileged knowledge, and you need to be prepared to share that knowledge in the best way possible. Work in partnership with the President on key communication actions and matters, and I guess that's sort of a sort of partnership that's really quite critical in nearly all clubs, because one does a lot of the communication by verbal means, and I guess the Secretary does a lot by the written word. And finally, may assume the role of public officer, that role that I mentioned earlier, because it is a very, very light role, doesn't take a lot of time. Next, the Treasurer. And I mentioned before that these are the three positions that I think are obviously critical to your club's success. Planning budgets, so really needs to be very comfortable with dealing with monetary matters, and part of that is maintaining financial records as well. Preparing key reports, including the AGM, and monitor a balance sheet, and keeping that balance sheet up to date is actually quite critical. Presenting financial status reports at committee meetings, I recommend that's done at every committee meeting, which raises some eyebrows, but it really only should take a couple of minutes, because if it's up to date, it's just saying, well, last month this is what we had in the bank, this is what we've got in the bank now, these are the bills we had to pay, and also gives an idea of perhaps bills that are coming, so that the club committee can be aware of balancing the financial issues that may be coming up in the future as well. Now, importantly, the Treasurer normally should also be educating the committee members on financial matters, and the reports are part of that, but many people don't realise that it's actually the responsibility of the whole committee to actually understand their financial situation, not just the Treasurer. There's a famous case in one of our regions where it was, and it's not the only one, but it's the one I'm very much aware of, where a case of fraud was enacted by the Treasurer, who defrauded the club of nearly $3,000, but nobody knew anything about what was going on until it was too late, and that person actually fled the country, believe it or not. So that's critical. And finally, prepare and assist with grant applications, which is an important way, of course, of getting financial support other than sponsorship. So those three are not an exhaustive list, but they're the key ones. And you may like to tailor additional points as well that relate to your club. I think it's a lot easier if you've got a good start, so I hope you find that that is helpful. Another opportunity to reflect, and I suggest that you undertake an audit of key committee roles, whatever they are, and actually think about, okay, how are we up to date with our roles? I mentioned before about induction. If there's a particular role that someone's going to play, I think they deserve to have an up-to-date role statement on what's going on. You can add to the role task behaviours or skills that would be useful as well. And I say useful because sometimes you're very lucky to get the ones you want, but at least it gives an idea of what's important in the role. Decide if role descriptions need to be set up or updated for any or all of those roles, and use the lists provided as a checklist, as I mentioned. Okay, now you'll see a little cartoon there with a rather deep cavernous ravine. On the left is come over here, which is probably a metaphor for me right now. And then also on the other side, how. So I don't want you to be in a position where you want to jump off the cliff and that's the end of it, but rather to be able to easily go across from one side to the other. So tips are really important, I think, to make it easier for you. They're just points that may be obvious to you, but they may also be very helpful for some people who haven't thought of them before. The The first thing is simple and in writing. So do dot points, for example. I've come across a lot of written material, which is sort of pages of like an essay. Dot points are really, really helpful. Better to have less but important than a whole lot of stuff that's mixed up and scrambled. Try and make things that you do collaborative in terms of your roles and responsibilities, so that you actually have a shared understanding of what's going on and what needs to go on. And of course be appropriately legally compliant, which speaks for itself. In sync with stakeholders' expectations as well. So again, it's very useful to communicate with your stakeholders to just check if there are issues around responsibilities that may need to be explained. I'd like to think that you develop your regulations or policies, which is a word I prefer to use, for almost everything. Your constitution is mainly around specific rules, the objects of the organisation, particular ways that you actually run your meetings and key approaches when you actually get together. But your policy should be almost anything from climate change policy to child care policy, all that sort of thing. So they are easy to change. You can change them at any ordinary meeting, whereas constitutional changes you require a special general meeting or an AGM. Be mindful of the overall objectives of your club and the code of conduct. Follow best practice clubs and organisations, then tailored to what you need and what you think fits you best. A lot of areas now in the whole of South Australia operate as hubs. Fortunately, some with great new facilities, and usually there's at least 4 clubs that are involved in the hubs. Maybe you can get together and actually share some of the information around this material to actually say, okay, what can we learn from each other to make our clubs more professional in the way we operate? And finally, again, link to parent body. They'll often have information there, and they can validate what you do too. So if you draft something, just send it to the parent body and say, how does this fit in with your expectations? So what's next? Okay, first of all, I suggest that you take what I call a club health check. And that's just to say, okay, where do you sit in relation to all of the issues around having an effective club? So there are a couple of resources there. You can actually look up the Office for Recreation, Sport and Racing Star Club, and they will have information there about doing a health check, and they've got a 25-question questionnaire which has a lot of tips and templates that actually back it up as well. And then also Sports Australia's game plan, which I also think is an excellent resource to actually look at. Just doing a survey, is your club healthy? And they're both based on Australia's best practice approaches to running a club. So you've got the best there. And it gives you an idea of what to measure against. Access additional tips and templates. Club Help is a great resource again. We'll have templates there available, as does an organisation called Sports Community. We've got website addresses there for you as well. And finally, contact your parent organisation or other sports clubs. I've mentioned it before. I think that could be improved. A lot of clubs just stick to themselves and don't even communicate with their parent club. So seek out best practice approaches. Star Club, for example, has about 250 clubs that have reached what is called a level 4 accreditation because they're considered to be the most effective in their management based on surveys, personal interviews and so on. So you could easily contact the office and say, well, are there clubs in my sport? It may be netball, it may be cricket, or it may be rowing. And say, okay, is there a club there that's actually got this accreditation? And you can liaise with them. And again, if you don't have to do it twice, use what they've got. And I think that's really a tip also worth considering. Okay, everyone, it's time to think about doing something about all of this now. I've actually put a little tip of the way you might do your action plans. And I use a terminology of what, why and how, because that's really important. What we want to work on and achieve is the decision you make about what aspects you may have listed earlier on, why it needs to be done, and that's really important because people in adult land in particular don't do things because we tell them to, but you need to have justification. And thirdly, how your task or tasks will be achieved. And I suggest something like brainstorming so that you actually work on some creative ways that you might be able to get things done. You need to agree on timelines as well, so there's some sense of an end point, who's responsible, and also the reporting needs back to the committee. The person responsible, by the way, is not always the person who actually does the work. Often it does end up like that, but this is where your subcommittees could come in handy. The person responsible is the one who's accountable for making sure it actually gets progressed and finished. Delegate activities by considering the skills of your committee members. So if you can align the tasks roughly to people who are able and willing to do it, obviously that's much better. But don't let it stop you from actually taking action in any way. All right, I think that is all I'm going to tell you for today. And I want to thank you, though, for watching and listening, and I hope that it's been useful to you and that your club thrives as a result. Thanks very much.